The morning briefing at Bagram Airfield had the usual rhythm of coffee cups against metal tables, and the low murmur of pilots reviewing flight plans when Colonel Marcus Hendricks walked in with an expression that made conversation stop mid-sentence. He carried a folder marked with red classification tape, the kind that meant someone's day was about to become considerably more complicated. The operations room smelled like jet fuel and stale air conditioning, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as the colonel spread reconnaissance photos across the briefing table. The images showed a valley in Kunar province, terrain so unforgiving it looked like the earth itself had decided to wage war. Steep ridges, narrow passes, and scattered compounds where insurgent activity had been steadily increasing for weeks. What made today different was the emergency beacon transmitting from a downed Chinook helicopter somewhere in that mess of rocks and hostility. The crew had been transporting a high-value intelligence asset when an RPG turned their bird into a falling brick. Now they were on the ground, surrounded, and the window for extraction was measured in hours, not days. The mission brief was straightforward in the way that made experienced pilots reach for their Lucky Charms close air support for a rescue operation in terrain, where one wrong turn meant controlled flight into a mountain face. The A-10 Thunderbolt was the only aircraft that could operate effectively in those conditions, flying low and slow enough to distinguish friendlies from hostiles in the visual chaos of mountain warfare. When Colonel Hendricks announced the assigned pilot, several officers exchanged glances. Captain Mariana Nomad Vega stood at the back of the room, her flight suit worn at the elbows, her dark hair pulled into a regulation bun that somehow still managed to look slightly defiant. She'd been flying A-10s for 6 years, most of that time in combat zones where the aircraft's reputation for survivability was tested daily. The other pilots knew her record competent, methodical, the kind of aviator who brought her aircraft home even when it looked like flying scrap metal. But competence and respect weren't always the same thing in a community where reputation mattered as much as flight hours. Vega had earned a call sign that told a story some of her colleagues preferred to ignore. Nomad, because she'd moved between squadrons more times than most pilots changed duty stations. The official reason was always operational necessity, but the unofficial version involved a custody battle that had dragged through family courts while she deployed overseas. A single mother flying attack missions wasn't the narrative that fit neatly into squadron culture. Some saw dedication, others saw distraction. Colonel Hendricks met her eyes across the room, and something in his expression suggested this mission carried weight beyond the tactical situation. He'd flown combat himself, back when the A-10 was still proving it deserved to exist despite Pentagon bureaucrats who wanted to retire the aircraft. The pre-flight inspection happened in the dawn light that painted the flight line in shades of amber and shadow. Vega walked around her A-10 with the practiced movements of someone who'd performed this ritual hundreds of times, her hands checking control surfaces and weapons pylons, with an attention to detail that bordered on meditative. The Thunderbolt looked like it had been designed by someone who understood that beauty in military aviation came from function, not form. The twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, the titanium bathtub protecting the cockpit, the massive GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon that formed the aircraft's entire reason for existence. Everything about the A-10 suggested a machine built to take punishment and keep fighting. Her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Ramon Delgado, stood nearby with a tablet showing the weapon's load. 4 Maverick missiles, 2 pods of Hydra rockets, and 1,100 rounds of 30mm ammunition for the cannon. The external fuel tanks were topped off, giving her enough loiter time to support the rescue operation for as long as the ground situation required. Delgado had been working A-10s longer than Vega had been flying them, and his maintenance crew treated each aircraft like a personal responsibility that transcended regulation manuals. He handed her the paperwork with a nod that communicated more than words. The bird was ready. The rest was up to her. The cockpit smelled like avionics and old coffee, familiar in the way that made the chaos of combat feel manageable. Vega settled into the ejection seat and began the startup sequence, switches and gauges coming to life in a choreographed progression that turned metal and electronics into something that could fly. The twin turbofans spooled up with their characteristic high-pitched whine, a sound that made ground troops in contact feel like salvation was overhead. She ran through the comm check with tower control, her voice steady and professional, the kind of calm that came from practice rather than absence of stress. The other pilots in the rescue package were already airborne, two Apache helicopters providing initial reconnaissance, a pair of F-16s flying top cover against any air threats, and a second A-10 that would orbit as her backup. The weather report showed clear skies over Kunar province, which meant visibility would be good, but also meant anyone with a rifle could see her coming from miles away. Vega taxied toward the runway, the A-10's nose gear strut absorbing the uneven concrete with the suspension geometry that let the aircraft operate from damaged airfields. She could see Colonel Hendricks standing near the tower, watching her departure with an intensity that suggested personal investment in the outcome. Whatever this mission represented to him, it went beyond standard operational concerns. The takeoff roll felt smooth, power-building as she advanced the throttles, and the Thunderbolt accelerated down the runway with its characteristic rumble. Rotation speed, stick back, and the aircraft lifted into the Afghan sky with the heavy grace of something built for purpose rather than elegance. Vega climbed to altitude, the Hindu Kush mountains spreading below her in jagged patterns of rock and snow that looked beautiful and deadly in equal measure. The radio came alive with coordinates and situation updates. The downed Chinook crew had fortified a position near the wreckage, but Taliban fighters were maneuvering through the ridgelines, working to surround the Americans before rescue forces could arrive. The Apache pilots reported taking small arms fire during their initial pass, tracers rising from compounds scattered through the valley like angry fireflies. Vega checked her system's displays, everything showing green, the aircraft responding to inputs with the solid feel that came from proper maintenance and good engineering. The mission clock was running, and somewhere below her, people were depending on her ability to deliver precision violence in a space measured in meters. She rolled into a descent, beginning the transition from transit altitude to combat operations, the world narrowing to instruments and terrain and the geometry of weapons employment. The A-10's handling characteristics changed as airspeed built, becoming more responsive, the control surfaces biting into air with authority. Vega's breathing slowed, settling into the rhythm that let her process information without being overwhelmed by it. Years of training and combat experience compressed into instinct, muscle memory, guiding hands and feet, while her conscious mind focused on tactical decisions. The radio crackled with the voice of the ground controller, a special forces operator whose calm professionalism couldn't quite hide the strain of being surrounded and outnumbered. He passed threat locations using terrain features, knowing that grid coordinates alone didn't capture the three-dimensional reality of mountain warfare. Vega acknowledged, her voice carrying none of the tension coiling in her chest. This was the moment where reputation either held or shattered, where competence became legacy, or just another mission that went wrong in the unforgiving algebra of combat aviation. The valley opened below her like a wound in the earth, steep walls channeling wind and bullets in unpredictable currents. Vega rolled inverted momentarily to get a better look at the tactical situation, the A-10 handling the maneuver with stolid reliability. She could see the Chinook wreckage, a broken shape against the brown landscape, and the defensive perimeter the crew had established using whatever cover the terrain provided. Smoke from a purple signal grenade marked their position, a splash of color that helped distinguish friendlies in the visual chaos. The Taliban positions were harder to spot, concealed among rocks and buildings that blended into the mountainside. The Apache pilots had marked several locations with laser designation, invisible to the naked eye but clear as daylight in her targeting pod display. Vega set up for her first pass, calculating angles and distances with the mental geometry that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. The A-10 descended into the valley, airspeed building as gravity added energy to her approach. She could feel the turbulence now, air currents bouncing off ridgelines and creating invisible obstacles that made precise flying essential. The ground controller's voice guided her toward the highest priority target, a machine gun position that had the rescue zone under direct fire. Vega pickled off a Maverick missile, the weapon dropping clear of the pylon and its rocket motor igniting in a flash of white exhaust. The missile tracked toward the infrared signature of the gun position, impact occurring seconds later in a blooming explosion that turned threat geometry into smoke and debris. The radio erupted with confirmation from the ground team, their relief audible even through professional military communication protocols. But one target eliminated didn't change the fundamental problem. The rescue force was still outnumbered, still surrounded, and the Taliban fighters were adapting to the air threat by dispersing and using covered approaches. Vega pulled up from her pass, climbing out of the valley with its engines howling under full power. She could feel the G-forces pressing her into the seat, blood pooling away from her brain as the aircraft converted speed into altitude. The world grayed at the edges before she leveled off and the pressure released. The tactical situation was evolving in real time, enemy fighters moving through terrain with the confidence of people who knew the ground better than any map could show. The second Taliban position revealed itself by opening fire on the defensive perimeter, muzzle flashes visible even in daylight from the volume of ammunition being expended. Vega rolled into another attack run, this time setting up for rockets rather than missiles. The math was different. Rockets were unguided, requiring precise aircraft positioning to put warheads on target. She descended again, the valley walls rising on either side like natural barriers that demanded respect and absolute focus. The targeting pipper in her heads-up display drifted across terrain features as she adjusted her dive angle, compensating for wind and the ballistic arc of 70mm rockets. The ground rushed up with the illusion of impossible speed, perception compressed by the concentration required to fly and fight simultaneously. At weapons release range, she fired a salvo, the rockets rippling off their pod in a sequence of ignitions that sent 19 pounds of high explosive toward the enemy position. The impacts walked across the ridgeline in a line of explosions that turned cover into kill zone, suppressing the Taliban fighters long enough for the ground team to reposition. The rescue helicopters were inbound now, a flight of Black Hawks escorted by the Apache, racing against time and ammunition expenditure to extract the Chinook crew before the situation became untenable. Vega's role shifted from striking targets to providing continuous presence, orbiting the valley in a pattern designed to keep weapons available while conserving fuel. The aircraft's endurance was legendary, but even legends had limits measured in pounds of JP-8 fuel and the physical toll of sustained combat operations. The G-forces from repeated attack runs accumulated in muscles and joints, the strain of high-performance flying compounded by the stress of making life-or-death decisions every few minutes. Vega's flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the cool air at altitude, adrenaline and exertion combining in the cocktail that defined combat aviation. The radio chatter increased as the rescue force approached the landing zone, multiple aircraft coordinating in three-dimensional space where mistakes had immediate consequences. The Taliban fighters recognized the extraction attempt and intensified their assault, small arms fire and RPGs converging on the defensive perimeter from multiple directions. The ground controller's voice became more urgent, calling out threats faster than Vega could service them all. She prioritized based on immediacy. The RPG team repositioning for a shot at the rescue helicopters took precedence over rifle fire that was suppressed by the perimeter defense. Vega rolled into a gun's pass, the decision made in the seconds it took to line up the attack. The GAU-8 Avenger was the A-10's defining feature, a 7-barrel rotary cannon that fired depleted uranium penetrators at a rate that made the aircraft shudder when the trigger was pressed. She told her daughter once that the gun was so powerful they designed the airplane around it, building everything else to support 30mm ammunition delivery. The targeting solution came together: Pipper on target, range within parameters, angle of attack shallow enough to avoid hitting friendlies. Vega squeezed the trigger, and the Avenger spoke with its distinctive roar, a sound like ripping canvas amplified through the physics of high-velocity projectiles tearing through air. The recoil was noticeable even in an aircraft weighing 23 tons, the nose dipping slightly as the gun fired in bursts that conserved ammunition while delivering devastating effects. The RPG team disappeared in impacts that chewed through rock and flesh with equal efficiency, the 30mm rounds designed to defeat armored vehicles making short work of personnel in the open. Vega pulled off target, clearing the flight path for the rescue helicopters now entering the valley in a tactical approach that used terrain masking to minimize exposure. The Black Hawks flared hard over the landing zone, their rotor wash creating dust clouds that obscured visibility but also concealed movement from enemy observers. The Chinook crew moved fast, combat loading techniques practiced until they became automatic even under fire. 30 seconds on the ground felt like 30 minutes when bullets were impacting around you. The extraction helicopters lifted off with the recovered crew, their departure covered by continuous fire from the Apache gunships and Vega's remaining ordnance. She fired her last Maverick missile at a mortar position that had been trying to range the landing zone, the weapon's impact silencing the threat in a conclusive demonstration of precision strike capability. The mission was approaching success, the primary objective achieved, but the fuel gauge showed a number that demanded attention. Vega had been in the combat zone for over an hour, maneuvering aggressively and burning fuel at rates that exceeded planning estimates. The math was simple: she had enough to make it back to Bagram with minimal reserve, assuming nothing went wrong. In combat aviation, assuming nothing went wrong was how pilots ended up walking home. The ground controller's voice came through one final time, expressing gratitude with the economy of words that military professionals used when emotions ran deeper than vocabulary could easily express. Vega acknowledged and turned toward home, climbing out of the valley that had tested her skills and her aircraft's capabilities in equal measure. The relief was tempered by exhaustion and the awareness that this mission was one of many, a single tactical success in a war measured in years rather than battles. She checked in with the airborne command post, reporting mission completion and current fuel state, the numbers triggering concern from the controller who ran calculations and determined she was cutting it close. The backup A-10 had already departed, fuel considerations forcing an earlier return to base. Vega was alone now, flying through Afghan airspace with enough fuel to make it home if everything went according to plan. The Hindu Kush spread below her in patterns of light and shadow, beautiful and indifferent to human struggles. She thought about her daughter, 8 years old and living with Vega's mother, while deployment kept them separated by 7,000 miles, and all the complications of shared custody arrangements. The family court had questioned whether active combat duty was compatible with primary custody, the judge expressing concern about stability and presence. The warning light illuminated without drama, a simple amber indicator on the fuel panel that transformed routine flight into something requiring immediate decision-making. Vega's eyes went to the gauge, confirming what the light indicated: fuel consumption was exceeding predictions, the difference small in percentage terms but significant when reserves were already minimal. She ran mental calculations: distance to Bagram versus fuel remaining versus consumption rate, the math coming up short by a margin too thin for comfort. The radio call to command post included that information, her voice maintaining professional composure while communicating urgency through clipped phraseology and precise numbers. The controller's response was immediate, offering vectors to alternate airfields, calculating distances and fuel requirements for options that might extend the possible range. But the alternates were controlled by different nations with different clearance procedures, and the time required to coordinate emergency landing permission wasn't guaranteed to be faster than just pushing for home field. Vega made the decision with the clarity that came from accepting consequences. She'd continue toward Bagram, managing fuel conservation through careful throttle management and optimal altitude selection. The A-10 wasn't designed for fuel efficiency, its mission profile prioritizing low-altitude survivability over range, but every pilot knew tricks for extending endurance when the situation demanded it. She climbed higher, seeking the altitude where engine efficiency improved and drag decreased, the aircraft settling into a cruise configuration that maximized miles per pound of remaining fuel. The gauges became her focus, numbers that would determine whether she landed conventionally or demonstrated why ejection seats existed. The minutes stretched with the peculiar elasticity of time under stress, each one containing more awareness than normal hours held. Vega's training included emergency procedures for fuel exhaustion, the checklist memorized and practiced until responses became automatic, but theory and reality existed in different emotional registers. She thought about the Chinook crew now safely extracted, their lives preserved by her weapons delivery and tactical decisions. The fuel quantity continued its inexorable decline, the gauge showing numbers that made each passing mile a small victory against mathematics. Vega contacted Bagram Tower, declaring a fuel emergency that gave her priority handling and put fire crews on alert. The controller's voice remained calm, professional, but she could hear the underlying concern that came from understanding the margins involved. She was committed now, no alternates within gliding distance, the outcome dependent on whether her calculations proved accurate or optimistic. The airfield appeared on the horizon, a collection of runways and buildings that represented safety if she could reach it. The tower cleared her for straightened approach, eliminating the fuel burn required for normal traffic patterns. Vega descended gradually, balancing the need to conserve fuel against the requirement to reach the runway at appropriate altitude. The A-10 glided well for an aircraft nicknamed Warthog, its low wing loading providing respectable lift-to-drag ratios, but gliding was emergency procedure territory, not normal operations. She kept power on, managing throttles with attention to engine instrumentation that showed fuel flow rates approaching zero. The mathematical reality was brutally simple. She would reach the runway or she wouldn't, and the difference would be measured in seconds of fuel remaining. The approach continued, altitude decreasing, distance to runway decreasing faster, the convergence of two numbers that would determine whether she walked away from this landing. Vega extended landing gear, accepting the drag penalty because the runway was close enough now that gear-up landing wouldn't improve the equation. The tower controller called distances, providing information she could already see, but which helped maintain situational awareness when stress narrowed perception. 1 mile out, 500 feet altitude, airspeed good, fuel quantity showing near zero. The runway threshold passed underneath, concrete appearing beneath her with the abruptness of salvation arriving at the last possible moment. Vega reduced power and flared, the settling onto the runway with its main gear first, then nose gear, a conventional landing that felt extraordinary given the circumstances. The rollout proceeded normally until both engines quit simultaneously, fuel exhaustion occurring after touchdown, but before she'd cleared the active runway. The A-10 coasted to a stop in the middle of Bagram's main runway, effectively blocking it until the aircraft could be towed clear. Emergency vehicles surrounded her immediately, fire trucks and maintenance crews responding to the declared emergency with procedures practiced until they became automatic. Vega shut down systems and opened the canopy, Afghan air rushing in with its characteristic heat and dust smell. Her hands were steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system, training and experience overriding the physiological responses to sustained stress. Staff Sergeant Delgado arrived in a maintenance truck, his expression mixing relief and professional assessment of the situation. The aircraft would need refueling and inspection before it could be moved, procedures that would take time and effectively shut down operations at one of Afghanistan's busiest military airfields. Colonel Hendricks appeared while maintenance crews were preparing to tow the A-10 clear, his presence unusual enough that Vega wondered what prompted personal involvement in post-mission logistics. He waited while she completed the shutdown checklist and descended from the cockpit, her legs slightly unsteady from over 2 hours in the seat under high stress. The colonel's expression was difficult to read, something between approval and concern, the look of someone processing multiple layers of information simultaneously. He didn't speak immediately, instead watching as the maintenance crew attached towing equipment and began the slow process of clearing the runway. Vega stood at attention, uncertain what this interaction represented beyond standard post-mission debriefing. Colonel Hendricks finally met her eyes with an intensity that suggested this conversation carried weight beyond typical officer-to-officer communication. His first question wasn't about the mission or the fuel situation, but about something more personal and unexpected. He asked if she knew why her call sign was Nomad, not just the official reason but the deeper story that most squadron members preferred not to discuss directly. Vega felt the question land with unexpected force, the shift from tactical discussion to personal territory catching her slightly off guard. She'd grown accustomed to maintaining professional distance, keeping family complications separate from military identity, but the colonel's question suggested he'd already done research that went beyond service records. She explained briefly the custody situation, the judge who'd questioned her deployment schedule, the extended family who'd provided stability while she served overseas. Her daughter lived with Vega's mother in Colorado, an arrangement that satisfied family court requirements while allowing Vega to continue flying combat missions. The moves between squadrons had come partly from operational necessity and partly from seeking environments where single parenthood wasn't viewed as professional liability. Some units were better than others about separating personal circumstances from performance evaluation, though the correlation wasn't always obvious from the outside. Colonel Hendricks listened without interrupting, his expression remaining neutral until she finished. Then he shared information that reframed the morning's mission in context she hadn't fully understood. The intelligence asset being extracted from Kunar province wasn't just another target in the endless succession of operations. The individual had been providing information that prevented multiple attacks on coalition forces, information that had almost certainly saved American lives, including possibly Vega's during previous missions. The rescue wasn't just tactical necessity, but personal stakes multiplied across networks of service and consequence that pilots rarely saw directly. More than that, Colonel Hendricks explained why he'd specifically assigned her to the mission despite knowing other pilots had questioned the decision. He'd reviewed her record completely, not just flight hours and weapons delivery statistics, but the accumulated evidence of someone who brought aircraft home regardless of damage or difficulty. The pattern was clear to anyone who looked beyond surface assumptions. Vega's competence wasn't despite her personal circumstances, but possibly because of them. Someone balancing single parenthood and combat aviation, developed skills in prioritization and stress management that translated directly to tactical decision-making under pressure. The conversation shifted something in how Vega understood her own position within squadron culture. She'd spent years assuming that being underestimated required constantly proving herself through perfect performance, maintaining professional distance to avoid appearing weak or distracted. Colonel Hendricks suggested an alternative perspective, that her experience managing complex personal circumstances while maintaining combat effectiveness represented exactly the kind of judgment military aviation required. The A-10 community valued pilots who could handle difficult situations with limited resources, who could bring damaged aircraft home when others might have ejected, who could make sound decisions under stress when perfect solutions weren't available. Vega had been demonstrating those qualities consistently, but the context of single parenthood had obscured the interpretation for observers focused on conventional career narratives. The colonel's words weren't dramatic or particularly emotional, just factual assessment delivered with the directness that characterized his leadership style. But they carried weight that accumulated in Vega's awareness like ballast shifting, changing how she understood her professional identity. The mission had succeeded not despite who she was, but in some fundamental way because of it. The ability to manage fuel exhaustion while maintaining tactical effectiveness came from the same mental framework that managed custody schedules and deployment logistics, and the constant background calculation of responsibility distributed across time zones and family structures. Colonel Hendricks concluded by mentioning that her performance report would reflect not just mission success, but the specific ways she demonstrated exceptional judgment under pressure. More immediately, he'd already initiated the paperwork to ensure her custody situation received appropriate documentation showing stable career progression and command confidence. Family courts responded to evidence of professional stability, and the military could provide that documentation when commanders chose to invest the effort. Vega felt something tighten in her chest, emotion breaking through the professional composure she'd maintained throughout the deployment. She managed a thank you that felt inadequate, but was all she could manage without losing the composure that military culture required. The debriefing that followed involved intelligence officers who wanted detailed information about enemy positions and tactics, maintenance personnel who needed to understand why fuel consumption exceeded predictions, and operations planners already incorporating lessons learned into future mission planning. Vega walked them through the engagement sequence, describing decisions and observations with the precision that made debriefing useful rather than just procedural. The fuel situation analysis revealed that battle damage from small arms fire had punctured one external tank, creating a slow leak that became significant over the extended combat period. The damage wasn't catastrophic enough to trigger immediate warning systems, but accumulated loss over time had created the critical shortage. The maintenance inspection discovered holes in the left external tank where rifle rounds had penetrated aluminum skin, the kind of damage that A-10s were designed to survive, but which still affected operational capability. Staff Sergeant Delgado showed her the punctures, his finger tracing paths where bullets had passed through without hitting critical systems, missing hydraulic lines and fuel feeds by margins measured in inches. The Thunderbolt's design philosophy emphasized survivability through redundancy and separation of critical components, engineering choices that looked like overdesign until combat demonstrated their value. Vega had brought home an aircraft that lesser designs might have lost, landing safely despite damage that would have been catastrophic in other airframes. The other pilots in her squadron approached during the afternoon, their congratulations carrying undertones of revised assessment. Word had spread about the fuel emergency landing and the mission success, information traveling through informal networks faster than official reports. The conversations were brief, professional acknowledgments that avoided excessive sentiment but communicated respect in the economy of military communication. Call signs that had been used with subtle dismissal now carried different connotations. Nomad transformed from criticism to badge of competence. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of cultural recalibration that happened when performance exceeded expectations in ways that demanded recognition. Evening found Vega in her quarters, exhaustion finally catching up with adrenaline depletion. She'd placed a video call to her daughter earlier, the conversation brief but grounding in ways that combat flying couldn't provide. 8-year-old questions about school and friends, and whether mom would be home for the science fair created contrast with the day's events that felt almost surreal in juxtaposition. Vega's mother had been supportive as always, managing the household routines that allowed Vega to maintain deployment schedules while knowing her daughter had stability and care. The custody arrangement worked because of family support that recognized military service as calling rather than career choice, sacrifice that extended beyond individual decisions. Vega thought about Colonel Hendrick's words, the reframing of her situation from professional liability to relevant experience. Years of managing perception and proving competence had created patterns of behavior that were hard to release even when external validation suggested they might no longer be necessary. But something had shifted today, not just in squadron culture, but in her own understanding of how personal and professional identities intersected. The A-10 community had always valued pilots who could bring damaged aircraft home, who could make sound decisions under pressure, who could perform when situations didn't follow planning assumptions. She'd been demonstrating those qualities for years, but the interpretation had been obscured by observers who saw single parenthood as distraction rather than relevant experience in managing complexity under stress. The mission's success wasn't despite her circumstances, but interconnected with capabilities those circumstances had developed. Managing fuel exhaustion while engaging targets and coordinating extraction required exactly the kind of multi-layered decision-making that defined her daily life outside the cockpit. She'd been training for today's mission, not just in simulators and training ranges, but in custody hearings and deployment planning, and every complicated decision that balanced duty and family across impossible distances. The recognition from Colonel Hendricks mattered not because she needed external validation, but because it suggested institutional space for narratives that didn't fit conventional military career templates. The next morning's brief included mission video and analysis, tactical lessons extracted from engagement sequences that would inform future operations. Vega watched her own gun camera footage with the detachment that experience provided, seeing decisions play out in recorded imagery that captured the geometry of combat without conveying the physical and mental intensity of actual execution. The precision of her weapons delivery was evident in how close impacts occurred to designated targets. 30mm rounds grouped tight despite maneuvering aircraft and stressed pilot, rockets landing in patterns that maximize suppression while minimizing collateral effects. The intelligence officers highlighted how her support had enabled the rescue operation, creating windows of opportunity through sustained fire that kept enemy fighters suppressed during critical moments. The Chinook crew had submitted statements for her record, describing the mission from ground perspective, where her weapons delivery had been difference between successful extraction and catastrophic outcome. Colonel Hendricks addressed the squadron after the technical debrief concluded, his comments going beyond standard mission analysis into broader themes about competence and assessment. He spoke about how military aviation required pilots who could handle uncertainty and make sound decisions with incomplete information, who could manage multiple competing demands simultaneously without losing focus on primary objectives. The best pilots weren't necessarily those with perfect records, but those who could bring aircraft and crew home when situations degraded beyond planning assumptions. Combat aviation selected for judgment under stress, for the ability to prioritize effectively when everything seemed important, for maintaining performance when resources were constrained and outcomes uncertain. These weren't abstract qualities but practical capabilities demonstrated through mission execution, visible in decisions made during the moments when theory confronted reality. He looked at Vega while speaking, making clear that his comments applied directly to yesterday's mission, while extending to broader patterns in how performance was evaluated and reputation established. The other pilots understood the implication, the colonel's words serving as official validation that carried weight within squadron culture. The formal recognition came through channels that military organizations used to document performance and build records that influenced career progression. Vega received official commendation for the rescue mission, her actions described in language that captured tactical success, while recognizing the difficult decisions required to achieve that success. The medal ceremony was brief, Colonel Hendricks presenting the award with words that emphasized judgment under pressure and mission accomplishment despite adversity. The other pilots attended in dress uniforms, the formality marking this as significant within squadron culture that typically avoided excessive ceremony. Vega stood at attention while the colonel pinned the medal to her uniform, aware that the physical award mattered less than what it represented in official record and command assessment. Beyond the paperwork and protocol, something else had shifted in how her presence registered within squadron dynamics. The informal conversations in the operations building had changed tone, call sign usage carrying respect rather than subtle dismissal. Other pilots sought her input on tactical questions with genuine interest in her perspective, recognizing that yesterday's performance represented accumulated expertise worth learning from rather than anomalous success to be downplayed. The shift was gradual but unmistakable, cultural recalibration happening through countless small interactions that revised previous assessments. Vega had always been competent, her flight records demonstrating consistent performance across deployments and missions, but competence without the right narrative context had been insufficient for full acceptance within the tight-knit community of attack pilots. The fuel emergency landing had provided narrative drama that made her capabilities visible in ways that routine excellence hadn't achieved. Sometimes institutional recognition required moments of crisis that made underlying competence undeniable, forcing acknowledgement that could no longer be deferred or minimized. The pattern was frustrating in its implications about how performance was evaluated, but Vega understood that changing institutional culture happened through accumulated examples rather than policy declarations. The custody hearing happened 2 weeks after she returned from deployment, family court proceedings that had been scheduled months in advance when legal calendars were set. Vega sat in Colorado courtroom wearing her dress uniform, the medals and insignia carrying information about service and accomplishment that translated awkwardly into civilian context. The judge reviewed updated documentation that Colonel Hendricks had ensured reached the court file performance reports, command letters, squadron assignments showing stable career progression, and institutional confidence. The opposing attorney, representing her ex-husband's petition for primary custody, argued that combat deployments created instability incompatible with child-rearing responsibilities. Vega's attorney responded with evidence about extended family support, deployment schedules that were predictable despite overseas location, and the military's institutional framework for managing family needs during service obligations. The judge asked questions that suggested genuine attempt to understand rather than predetermined outcome, inquiries about how Vega managed parenting responsibilities while deployed, what support systems existed for her daughter during absence, how military service affected her availability for school events and medical appointments. Vega answered directly, acknowledging challenges while describing the practical solutions that made the arrangement work. Her mother had relocated to be primary caregiver during deployments, providing stability and continuity that allowed Vega's daughter to maintain school enrollment and social connections. Video calls maintained daily contact across time zones, technology bridging physical distance in ways previous military generations hadn't available. The military provided resources for family support, counseling services and coordination that recognized service members had responsibilities beyond tactical missions. Colonel Hendricks' letter described her as exemplary officer, whose judgment under pressure demonstrated exactly the kind of responsible decision-making that effective parenting required. The argument wasn't that military service had no costs, but that those costs were managed through support structures that provided stability even during deployment. The judge's decision came after reviewing evidence and testimony, the ruling favoring continuation of current custody arrangement, with modifications to visitation schedule. The relief Vega felt was complicated by awareness that legal victories didn't resolve underlying tensions between military service and family responsibilities. The custody arrangement worked but required constant attention and coordination. Phone calls with her mother to manage schedules, communication with school administrators about deployment timelines, backup plans for emergencies that might occur while she was overseas. The complexity was sustainable but never simple, each deployment requiring reassessment of logistics and contingencies. She wondered sometimes about alternative paths, career decisions that would have involved less combat and more stability, assignments that prioritized family proximity over operational tempo. But those alternatives felt hypothetical in ways that suggested they'd never been real options. Her identity, too, bound up with flying and tactical missions, to imagine satisfaction in roles that didn't involve combat aviation. The A-10 community had become her professional home, not because the aircraft was forgiving of divided attention, but because its mission profile demanded exactly the kind of focused intensity she could provide despite complicated circumstances. Some pilots flew to escape personal complexity. Others flew because the clarity of tactical decision-making provided structure that civilian life lacked. Vega flew because combat aviation required capabilities she possessed, and because proving competence in domains where she'd been underestimated felt like moral necessity rather than career ambition. The motivation was complicated, mixing service obligation with personal validation and the simple satisfaction of doing difficult things well. Colonel Hendricks understood that complexity, his leadership style recognizing that the best pilots often had non-standard backgrounds and motivations that didn't fit conventional career narratives. He'd built squadron culture that valued performance over pedigree, creating space for capabilities that emerged from unexpected combinations of experience and circumstance. The A-10 community had always been slightly outside mainstream fighter culture, flying an aircraft that defense analysts periodically tried to retire despite its continued effectiveness in close air support roles that other platforms couldn't duplicate. The Warthog attracted pilots who valued mission accomplishment over aesthetic elegance, who preferred survivability over speed, who found satisfaction in bringing ordnance precisely to target rather than breaking altitude records. The deployment continued with missions that became routine in the way that combat operations paradoxically could, danger managed through procedures and training, until exceptional circumstances felt like variations on familiar themes. Vega flew close air support sorties across Afghanistan's complex terrain, her targeting decisions affecting ground operations in ways she rarely witnessed directly. The feedback loop in combat aviation was often indirect targets eliminated, threats suppressed, friendly forces able to maneuver or extract without casualties. Success was measured in negative space, outcomes that didn't happen because air support prevented them. Occasionally, ground commanders sent messages through official channels expressing appreciation, but mostly the work proceeded without dramatic acknowledgement beyond mission completion reports. The other pilots treated her differently now, subtle shifts in how call signs were used, and whose tactical opinions received attention during briefing discussions. Vega found herself included in informal mentoring conversations with newer pilots, her experience valued as resource for understanding how to manage the mental demands of sustained combat operations. She talked about compartmentalization techniques, how to maintain focus during missions while keeping personal concerns from interfering with tactical decision-making. The advice came from experience rather than theory, lessons learned through trial and error about what worked when stakes were immediate and unforgiving. Some pilots struggled with the psychological complexity of delivering lethal force, the moral weight of weapons employment decisions that had permanent consequences. Vega's perspective emphasized the moral necessity of precision, the responsibility to protect friendly forces by eliminating threats efficiently and accurately. The gun camera footage from each mission became evidence for post-flight review, recordings that showed not just where ordnance impacted but how targeting decisions reflected judgment about proportionality and precision. Every trigger pull, every missile launch, every rocket salvo represented decision point where her training and moral framework intersected with tactical necessity. The responsibility was immense, but manageable through focus on immediate task rather than abstract consideration of broader implications. Ground troops depended on her weapons delivery to survive contact with enemy forces, that dependency creating moral clarity that transcended philosophical uncertainty. The squadron's culture shifted gradually as more pilots arrived with non-traditional backgrounds, women and men whose paths to combat aviation hadn't followed the standard academy to fighter-to-attack aircraft pipeline. Some had been enlisted crew chiefs who'd earned pilot slots through technical expertise. Others had transferred from transport aviation, seeking more direct combat roles. Still others had navigated family obligations and custody arrangements similar to Vega's circumstances. The diversity of backgrounds enriched squadron capability, different perspectives generating better solutions to tactical problems that had multiple possible approaches. Colonel Hendricks actively recruited for capability rather than pedigree, building team composition around mission requirements rather than conventional career templates. The A-10 community had always been slightly outside mainstream Air Force culture, flying an aircraft that looked ugly but performed brilliantly in the specific role for which it was designed. The Thunderbolt's mission profile attracted pilots who valued substance over style, who found satisfaction in close air support's direct impact on ground operations rather than the abstract geometry of air-to-air combat. Vega embodied that ethos, her flying characterized by precision and persistence rather than dramatic maneuvers or speed records. She brought aircraft home damaged. She delivered weapons exactly where ground controllers requested. She maintained composure under stress when situations degraded beyond planning assumptions. The competence was quiet and consistent, the kind of excellence that accumulated through hundreds of missions flown with attention to detail and responsibility for consequences. Her call sign had evolved in meaning, nomad no longer carrying implications of instability, but suggesting instead the adaptability and resilience required to succeed in environments that didn't accommodate conventional approaches. The name fit her better now, descriptive of someone who'd navigated uncertain terrain and emerged with capabilities that stationary paths wouldn't have developed. The final weeks of deployment involved transfer of responsibility to replacement pilots, the rotation cycle that kept squadrons operational while allowing individuals to return home and decompress from sustained combat operations. Vega flew her last missions with awareness that this deployment would shape how she understood her professional identity going forward. The recognition from Colonel Hendricks and squadron peers had validated capabilities she'd been demonstrating for years, but more importantly had created space within institutional culture for narratives that didn't follow conventional templates. She wasn't just competent despite being single mother. She was competent in ways that her experience managing complex responsibilities had developed. The custody situation wasn't professional liability to be overcome, but relevant background that informed judgment under pressure, decision-making under uncertainty, priority management when everything seemed important simultaneously. The reframing mattered not because external validation was necessary, but because institutional culture that recognized diverse paths to excellence created conditions where more people could contribute effectively. Military aviation had always needed pilots who could handle stress and make sound decisions with incomplete information, but the sources of those capabilities were broader than traditional career paths acknowledged. Vega's success demonstrated possibility for others whose backgrounds didn't fit standard narratives, creating precedent that made similar paths more navigable for future pilots facing comparable circumstances. The impact extended beyond individual career to cultural evolution within communities that valued performance. but hadn't always recognized all the contexts where relevant capabilities developed. Colonel Hendricks understood that dynamic, his leadership deliberately building more inclusive squadron culture not through policy declarations, but through consistent recognition of performance regardless of background. The approach worked because it aligned institutional values, mission accomplishment, sound judgment, competence under pressure, with broader aperture for how those qualities manifested and where they developed. Vega had become example not because she sought that role, but because her performance under difficult circumstances made certain arguments impossible to dismiss. The flight home happened through military transport, cargo aircraft carrying personnel and equipment across the complicated logistics network that sustained overseas operations. Vega slept fitfully during the long journey, exhaustion finally catching up with adrenaline depletion and accumulated stress from months of sustained combat flying. Her thoughts drifted between mission memories and anticipation of reunion with her daughter, the transition from combat zone to home environment creating psychological dissonance that all deploying service members navigated. She'd be back in Colorado within days, able to resume primary custody and daily parenting responsibilities that deployment had temporarily suspended. Her mother had maintained household stability, ensuring Vega's daughter had consistent routines and support despite the complications of having a parent deployed overseas. The arrangement worked because of family commitment that transcended individual decisions, support networks that recognized military service, involved collective, rather than purely individual sacrifice. Vega felt gratitude that was difficult to express adequately, awareness that her career depended on foundation of family support that made deployment sustainable. Her daughter had grown during the months apart, development continuing despite physical separation, her 8-year-old perspective incorporating, understanding that mom's job involved danger and importance in equal measure. The video calls had maintained connection, technology bridging distance in ways that made absence more manageable even when it couldn't eliminate the fundamental reality of separation. Vega looked forward to normal routine school pickups and homework help and bedtime stories, with intensity that suggested how much those everyday moments mattered against backdrop of combat deployment. The contrast between tactical missions and domestic routines was extreme but manageable through compartmentalization that let her function effectively in both domains. She'd learned to shift mental frameworks rapidly, transitioning from weapons employment decisions to parenting discussions without letting either context contaminate the other. The skill was hard-earned, developed through years of practice and numerous mistakes, but had become fundamental to how she navigated life that spanned military service and family responsibilities. The welcome home ceremony at the airbase was brief, official recognition of deployment completion that allowed squadron members to disperse toward families and leave periods. Colonel Hendricks spoke about mission accomplishments and individual performances, his words acknowledging collective effort while recognizing specific contributions that had exceeded expectations. Vega stood with other pilots in dress uniform, medals and insignia representing service and achievement in condensed visual language. She saw her mother and daughter in the crowd of families, their presence making the abstract concept of home concrete in ways that emotional reunion would shortly reinforce. The formal ceremony concluded, and the organized formation dissolved into individual reunions that military families navigated with practiced efficiency. Vega's daughter ran toward her with 8-year-old enthusiasm that made careful military bearing impossible to maintain. The embrace was tight and extended, months of separation compressed into physical contact that communicated more than video calls ever could. Her mother's hug followed, gratitude and relief mixing with pride in expression that suggested how much worry had accompanied news of combat missions and emergency landings. They tracked her deployment through official updates and personal communication, aware in general terms of the dangers involved even when specific missions remained classified. Now she was home, physically present rather than voice on screen or abstract worry about something that might happen in distant combat zone. The relief was palpable, tension releasing that none of them had been fully aware they were carrying. Vega felt her own emotional responses surfacing now that professional composure was no longer required, the controlled calm that sustained her through deployment giving way to feelings that were messier and more human. She'd survived another deployment, completed missions that saved lives, and contributed to objectives larger than individual sorties, and returned to family that made the sacrifice meaningful beyond abstract duty. The balance was precarious, constantly renegotiated, never simple or guaranteed. But today it felt sustainable, the separate domains of her life aligned rather than competing. She was mother and pilot, family member and tactical aviator, person whose identity encompassed both nurturing and controlled violence without contradiction. The weeks following return involved reintegration, routines that military families navigated with varying success, transitions from deployment mentality to domestic life, requiring conscious effort and mutual patience. Vega found herself waking at odd hours, body clock still adjusted to Afghan time zones and deployment rhythms. Her daughter had questions about the deployment that Vega answered carefully, balancing honesty about danger with reassurance about training and preparation that made risks manageable. 8-year-old cognition could handle complexity better than many adults assumed, understanding that important work sometimes involved danger without requiring graphic details about combat violence. They talked about the A-10, her daughter fascinated by aircraft specifications and weapons systems, in ways that suggested engineers' mindset developing. Vega described how the Thunderbolt was designed for survivability, multiple redundant systems ensuring pilots could bring damaged aircraft home, titanium bathtub protecting cockpit from ground fire that would be catastrophic in less robust designs. The engineering philosophy matched parenting approach build in redundancy and safety margins, plan for things going wrong, create systems that degraded gracefully rather than failing catastrophically. Her daughter understood intuitively, asking questions that showed she grasped the underlying principles even when technical details exceeded her current knowledge base. The conversations became ritual during evening routines, time together that rebuilt connection after months of separation. Vega felt her deployment persona gradually receding, tactical mindset giving way to domestic focus that required different but equally important capabilities. She attended parent-teacher conferences and helped with homework assignments, coached youth soccer, and managed household logistics that had been her mother's responsibility during deployment. The transition was smoother this time than previous rotations, practice making the psychological shifts more manageable even when they remained challenging. She'd learned that reintegration required conscious effort and realistic expectations, that neither she nor her daughter should expect immediate return to pre-deployment normal. They'd both changed during months apart, growth continuing even across distance, relationship evolving rather than simply pausing and resuming. The work involved rebuilding daily patterns while acknowledging those changes, finding new equilibrium rather than forcing return to previous arrangements. The follow-up custody hearing occurred 3 months after return from deployment, legal process requiring documentation that arrangement remained stable and appropriate for child's welfare. Vega's attorney presented evidence of reintegration success school performance records, teacher evaluations, medical checkup results showing her daughter thriving despite parental deployment. Colonel Hendrick's original letter remained in the case file, but additional documentation now included post-deployment evaluation and confirmation of continued command confidence. The opposing attorney had less ammunition this time, previous arguments about instability undermined by demonstrated stability across deployment cycle. The judge's questions focused on sustainability. Could Vega maintain this arrangement through future deployments? What happened if custody became impractical during extended overseas assignment? How would she handle emergency situations that might arise while she was in combat zone? The answers involved showing robust support systems and contingency planning, family backup, and military resources that made risks manageable if not eliminable. Her mother testified about providing care during deployment, describing routines and relationship quality that gave the judge concrete sense of how arrangement functioned in practice. Vega's daughter was old enough now that her preferences carried weight, the judge asking careful questions that assessed whether the current arrangement worked from her perspective. 8-year-old testimony was limited but clear. She wanted to live with her mother, understood that mom's job sometimes required absence, felt secure in the support provided during deployments. The judge's ruling maintained current custody arrangement, with acknowledgement that future deployments would require updated review. But the decision established precedent that military service and primary custody weren't inherently incompatible when proper support systems existed. Vega felt relief mixed with awareness that this issue would remain ongoing rather than permanently resolved, each deployment potentially triggering renewed custody evaluation. But the pattern was sustainable, institutional recognition that her military service and parenting responsibilities could coexist with proper planning and family support. The legal victory mattered less than the framework it established, precedent that made future negotiations more predictable even when they remained necessary. The return to flight status involved proficiency checks and training updates, procedures ensuring pilots maintained capability during leave periods between deployments. Vega flew local training missions that felt routine after combat operations, pattern work and instrument approaches executed with competence that reflected thousands of hours in type. The A-10 felt familiar in ways that transcended technical knowledge, aircraft handling and systems operation, intuitive through practice that had made conscious thought unnecessary for routine operations. She flew with newer pilots sometimes, sharing tactical knowledge and perspective that came from combat experience. The mentoring relationship worked both directions. She taught weapons employment techniques and threat response tactics. They reminded her about procedural updates and technical modifications that had occurred during her deployment. The squadron culture had continued evolving. Colonel Hendrick's leadership approach gradually transforming community norms around performance evaluation and career progression. More pilots now had non-traditional backgrounds, creating critical mass where diversity became normal rather than exceptional. Vega's presence registered differently than during early squadron assignments. Her record and reputation established enough that competence was assumed rather than questioned. The shift was subtle but significant baseline credibility that let her focus on mission rather than constantly proving worth. She still flew with intensity and attention to detail that combat operations demanded, but the internal tension about recognition had eased. Colonel Hendricks had retired shortly after the deployment concluded, his leadership leaving lasting impact on squadron culture that persisted beyond individual tenure. The new commander maintained similar approach, valuing performance and judgment over conventional career narratives, building team capability through inclusive assessment of talent. The continuity suggested cultural changes had become institutional rather than dependent on specific leader, systemic evolution that would shape how future pilots experience the community. Vega remained involved in developing those norms, her example providing template for others navigating similar circumstances. She'd become mentor and role model not through seeking the position, but through accumulated performance that made certain arguments visible and undeniable. Years passed with rhythm of deployment cycles and domestic interludes, Vega's career progressing through standard advancement, while her daughter grew from 8 to 12 to 16, adolescence bringing new complexities to custody arrangements and family dynamics. The teenage years involved different challenges than early childhood, navigating independence and identity formation, across the disruption of parental deployments. Vega handled it with same approach that characterized her flying attention to detail, clear communication, adaptation to changing circumstances, without losing sight of fundamental objectives. Her daughter had developed strong independence, comfort with mother's absence that came from years of managed separation and proven patterns of reunion. She'd grown up understanding military service as normal rather than exceptional, deployment cycles as rhythm of life rather than crisis to be endured. The familiarity didn't eliminate difficulty, but made it manageable, predictable pattern rather than uncertain threat. Vega's mother remained integral to support structure, now grandmother providing not just childcare but relationship continuity that enriched her granddaughter's life beyond practical necessity. The arrangement had evolved from contingency plan into chosen family structure that benefited everyone involved, multiple generations contributing to household stability in ways that distributed responsibility and strengthened relationships. Vega's career advancement brought leadership roles, increased responsibility that matched accumulated experience and demonstrated judgment. She'd commanded flights and trained new pilots, her tactical knowledge sought for mission planning and squadron development. The call sign Nomad had become mark of respect, shorthand for capabilities proven through countless missions and difficult circumstances navigated successfully. Other pilots sought her mentorship, particularly those managing similar balances between military service and family complexity. She'd become institutional knowledge, example of how non-standard paths could lead to excellence when supported appropriately and recognized fairly. Colonel Hendrick's influence persisted in squadron culture. He'd helped shape leadership philosophy that valued mission accomplishment and sound judgment over conventional career progression. The A-10 community had always been slightly outside mainstream Air Force culture, but that outsider status now felt less like disadvantage than distinctive identity, community confident in its capabilities and mission relevance. The final mission of Vega's career happened without dramatic circumstance or emergency crisis. Routine close air support sortie that concluded with normal landing and aircraft shutdown. But the significance lay not in exceptional performance, but in accumulated meaning final tactical flight, representing thousands of hours and countless missions, executed with consistent competence across 20-year career. She walked around the A-10 one last time, hand trailing across titanium and aluminum that had protected her through multiple deployments and dangerous circumstances. The aircraft showed wear from years of service, paint scratched and panels dented from maintenance access, but the fundamental soundness remained evident in how systems responded and flight controls felt. Staff Sergeant Delgado, now Senior Master Sergeant after his own career progression, supervised the post-flight inspection with same attention to detail he'd brought to their first mission together. They'd aged in parallel, both shaped by years of combat operations and institutional evolution, relationship built through shared commitment to aircraft and mission rather than social connection outside professional context. He congratulated her on career completed, words economical but conveying respect earned through consistent performance. The squadron held retirement ceremony that balanced formal recognition with community celebration, Colonel Hendrick's successor presenting awards, while current pilots shared anecdotes and appreciation. Vega's daughter attended wearing Air Force Academy uniform, her own path toward military aviation now visible in choices that suggested both independent judgment and maternal influence. The continuity felt appropriate, next generation finding their own relationship with service and sacrifice, while building on foundation previous generation established. Vega spoke briefly about what the career had meant, words carefully chosen to acknowledge both satisfaction and complexity, pride and cost, individual achievement and collective support that made it possible. She thanked family for enabling her service, particularly her mother whose presence throughout deployments had provided stability that made military career compatible with parenting responsibilities. She thanked squadron members for acceptance that had sometimes been hard-won, but eventually arrived. Community that valued performance and created space for diverse paths to excellence. The transition to civilian life brought expected challenges and unexpected satisfactions, redefining identity that had been bound up with military aviation for 2 decades. Vega found work in aerospace industry, her tactical experience valuable for weapons systems development and pilot interface design. The role let her contribute to improving aircraft that would protect future pilots, engineering decisions informed by countless hours experiencing what worked under stress and what created unnecessary complexity. She consulted with defense contractors developing next-generation close air support platforms, arguing for design features that prioritize survivability and weapons delivery precision over speed metrics that sounded impressive, but didn't align with mission requirements. The advocacy felt like continuation of service rather than departure from it. Different context for applying expertise and judgment developed through years of operational flying. Her daughter progressed through academy training, showing aptitude for aviation that suggested career path would eventually lead back to tactical aircraft, and potentially the A-10 community that had shaped her mother's professional identity. Vega watched that development with mixture of pride and concern, understanding both the satisfaction of military aviation and the costs it exacted from practitioners and families. She didn't discourage or encourage explicitly, instead providing honest perspective that let her daughter make informed choices about whether the sacrifices were worthwhile for her. The conversations echoed discussions she'd had years earlier with Colonel Hendricks, explorations of what made competence possible and how personal circumstances intersected with professional capability. Her daughter had grown up seeing both sides of military service, the meaning and accomplishment alongside the difficulty and separation, understanding, in concrete terms, what the career involved beyond abstraction. The choice to pursue aviation came from that informed perspective rather than naive idealism or simple desire to follow maternal path. Vega respected the decision, while acknowledging complexity it would bring to her daughter's life, challenges that would require similar navigation of competing responsibilities and skeptical assessment from those who underestimated capability based on circumstances. Years after retirement, Vega received invitation to speak at Air Force Weapons School, addressed to next generation of tactical aviators about combat decision-making and mission execution under pressure. She prepared remarks that balanced technical discussion with broader themes about judgment and resilience, capability emerging from unexpected contexts and institutional cultures that recognized performance regardless of background. The audience included pilots from multiple communities, fighters and bombers and special operations, but the A-10 contingent was largest Warthog community, sending pilots to advanced tactical training that would shape how they understood and executed close air support mission. Vega talked about the fuel emergency landing that had concluded the Kunar rescue mission, describing decisions and alternatives with analytical precision that captured both technical and psychological complexity. But she expanded beyond that individual mission to discuss patterns across career, how managing difficult circumstances developed capabilities relevant to tactical aviation, how competence emerged from non-standard paths when institutions created space for diverse experiences, how the best pilots often had backgrounds that didn't fit conventional templates, because those backgrounds developed judgment under pressure and priority management that tactical flying required. She showed mission footage and discussed weapons employment decisions, technical material that weapons school students needed to understand. But she also talked about being underestimated, about earning respect through consistent performance, about the specific ways that managing single parenthood and combat deployments had developed capabilities that served her well in cockpit. The audience engaged with questions that suggested genuine interest rather than polite attention, pilots recognizing that her experience offered lessons applicable to their own career development. Several women pilots approached afterward, describing their own navigation of military culture and family responsibilities, expressing appreciation for perspective that acknowledged complexity without minimizing either service commitment or personal circumstances. Vega shared contact information and offered mentorship, creating networks of support that extended beyond individual conversations to broader community building among pilots managing similar balances. The legacy question became more apparent as years accumulated, pattern of influence visible in career trajectories of pilots who'd served under her mentorship and squadron cultures that had evolved partly through examples she'd helped establish. The specific tactical missions she'd flown mattered in immediate context of those operations, lives saved, and objectives accomplished through her weapons delivery and judgment under pressure. But the longer-term impact came through how her career had demonstrated possibility, creating institutional precedent that made similar paths more navigable for future aviators facing comparable circumstances. Military culture changed slowly, institutional inertia, resisting rapid evolution, even when operational needs suggested alternative approaches would be beneficial. But accumulated examples could shift norms over time, individual performances combining to establish patterns that became expectations. Vega's career had contributed to that gradual transformation, demonstrating that combat effectiveness and family responsibility weren't mutually exclusive when proper support systems existed, and command leadership recognized diverse sources of relevant capability. The argument wasn't that military service involved no sacrifice or that deployments created no difficulty for families, but that those costs were manageable when institutional culture acknowledged complexity and built support structures rather than treating non-standard circumstances as disqualifying factors. The change mattered not just for individual careers, but for organizational capability, military effectiveness enhanced by drawing talent from broader population, and recognizing competence regardless of background. The A-10 community had been slightly ahead of broader Air Force culture in that evolution, platform mission profile attracting pilots who valued substance over style and community identity, allowing space for diverse paths to excellence. But the pattern was spreading, other communities recognizing that combat aviation required capabilities that emerged from varied experiences, and that conventional career templates weren't the only routes to developing sound judgment under pressure. Vega's daughter progressed through flight training and operational assignments, her career unfolding with access to institutional support and cultural acceptance that previous generation had helped establish through accumulated performance and persistent advocacy. The recognition came decades after the Kunar rescue mission, when aviation historians documenting close air support operations contacted Vega for interviews about missions that had shaped tactical doctrine and influenced aircraft design philosophy. The fuel emergency landing had become case study in multiple contexts: survivability engineering, weapons employment tactics, pilot decision-making under resource constraints. The mission video was used in training programs, her radio communications and weapons delivery studied by analysts developing improved procedures for similar scenarios. But beyond the technical details, the mission had become example of capabilities that emerged from circumstances that institutional culture had sometimes dismissed as professional liability. The historians wanted to understand not just what happened during the mission, but how Vega's background had influenced decision-making, what aspects of managing single parenthood and deployment cycles had translated into relevant tactical capabilities. She explained the patterns she'd identified over years of reflection: priority management under competing demands, decision-making with incomplete information, sustained focus despite stress and distraction, compartmentalization that let her function effectively across domains that required different mindsets. These weren't abstract qualities, but practical capabilities developed through experience navigating complexity, skills that proved directly applicable when combat flying, demanded similar mental frameworks. The historians documented her perspective alongside tactical analysis, capturing human dimension of how competence developed and how institutional culture shaped which capabilities were recognized and valued. The resulting publication discussed the Cunard mission within broader context of close air support evolution, examining how individual pilot capabilities intersected with aircraft design philosophy and tactical doctrine to create effective combat capability. Vega appeared as central figure in narrative that extended beyond single mission to career patterns and cultural transformation within military aviation communities. The recognition felt appropriate in its focus on mission accomplishment rather than personal drama, emphasis on tactical effectiveness that aligned with her own values, and how she understood her career significance. She'd never sought attention or special treatment, just opportunity to serve effectively and recognition, that her performance merited respect regardless of personal circumstances that some observers had viewed as professional disadvantage. The final reflection came during conversation with her daughter, now experienced combat pilot commanding her own A-10 flight and mentoring junior aviators navigating career challenges. They talked about how military culture had evolved across their respective careers, changes that had made paths like theirs more navigable while acknowledging work that remained to fully realize institutional potential. Vega's daughter described squadron environment where family circumstances were treated as normal variation rather than exceptional challenge requiring special accommodation, command culture that evaluated performance without filtering assessment through assumptions about conventional career templates. The evolution wasn't complete, gaps remained between policy statements and lived experience, institutional commitment sometimes exceeding practical implementation. But the trajectory suggested sustainable progress, accumulated examples, creating expectations that future leaders would continue building more inclusive communities. They discussed the call sign Nomad, how its meaning had transformed across Vega's career from subtle dismissal to respected designation that captured resilience and adaptability. Her daughter had earned her own call sign through different circumstances, but understood the power of language to shape perception and how squadron culture evolved through countless small interactions that gradually revised collective understanding. They talked about Colonel Hendrick's legacy, leadership philosophy that had influenced multiple generations of pilots through direct command and indirect example. His insistence on evaluating performance over pedigree had created cultural foundation that persisted beyond his tenure, institution memories embodied in practices and expectations that shaped how subsequent leaders approached command. The conversation ranged across decades and multiple deployments, mother and daughter comparing experiences that revealed both continuity and change in military aviation culture. Vega felt satisfaction seeing her daughter navigate challenges with capabilities developed partly through maternal example, but fundamentally through her own judgment and resilience. The generational progression suggested that the work of establishing inclusive institutional cultures was ongoing process rather than completed achievement, each generation building on previous foundations while addressing remaining gaps between aspiration and reality. The story concludes not with dramatic finale, but with quiet recognition that careers like Vega's had shaped institutional evolution in ways that extended beyond individual achievement to cultural transformation. The morning when Colonel Hendricks lowered his head in respect after the fuel emergency landing had marked moment when accumulated competence could no longer be dismissed or minimized, when performance demanded recognition that transcended assumptions about conventional career paths. But that single moment represented longer pattern of consistent excellence. Thousands of missions flown with attention to detail and judgment under pressure that characterized true professionalism. The A-10, with its torn wings coming home, had become symbol of survivability that extended beyond engineering design to human resilience. Pilot and aircraft both demonstrating capacity to endure damage and continue functioning when circumstances exceeded planning assumptions. Vega's career had embodied that resilience, navigating institutional skepticism and family complexity, while maintaining combat effectiveness that served mission requirements and protected ground troops depending on her weapons delivery. The legacy wasn't primarily personal achievement but institutional contribution, career that helped establish precedent for recognizing diverse paths to excellence and valuing judgment developed through varied experiences. The single mother who'd been underestimated had demonstrated capabilities that tactical aviation required, proving through accumulated performance that competence emerged from unexpected contexts when institutional culture created space for talent regardless of background. The story mattered not because it was exceptional, but because it was replicable, pattern that other aviators could follow when leadership recognized performance over pedigree and built communities that valued mission accomplishment above conventional career templates. Colonel Hendricks had understood that dynamic, his respect earned through observing pattern rather than responding to single dramatic mission. The weapons school address, the historical documentation, the mentorship relationships, all represented ripples from decisions made during combat missions and family courts, tactical flying and custody hearings, choices that had shaped not just individual career, but broader cultural evolution within military aviation communities that would extend decades into future.